This will be another lesson in the series Becoming Human, and here we'll focus on key figures on the path to humanity. We previously learned that some 6 or 7 million years ago, one common ancestral species of ape split into two evolutionary lineages. And scientists think this was due to climate changes, and the forests were receding, and woodlands and grasslands were opening up. So those ape ancestors that stayed in the forest, they evolved into the modern-day chimps and bonobos, and those ape ancestors that had to make a living in the new woodland grassland environment, they ended up evolving into modern humans. So like all other examples on the tree of life, when one species gets fragmented into two different environments, you can have the conditions for the evolution of separate species. So here's our 6 million year journey. And here are some of the names of our ancestors. We are called Homo sapiens, Homo Latin for human or man, and sapiens Latin for wise or astute. And in this lesson then we'll look at some of the key innovations on the path towards modern humans. Some of the stars in the show will be Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and then there are some more modern groups here as well. We're going to focus on these four in this lesson. Now, just a note about who gets included into the genus Homo, and the way scientists look at this is you have to have a certain brain size. It's got to be a brain size bigger than the Australopithecines, and their brains were not much bigger than chimps. So when we start to see an increase in brain size, then you get included into the genus Homo. So, like all other species on the tree of life, we humans were subject to the forces of natural selection. Natural selection was modifying our ancestors to become the species we are today. In particular, natural selection favored modifications of ape anatomy to better fit the woodland grassland habitat. So we have this major transition from a species that was adapted to the forest, but now they're going to have to evolve adaptations for the woodland grassland environment. And one of the key evolutionary innovations is bipedalism. And this is this transition from an anatomy that allows you to do knuckle walking, so walking on all fours, to an upright bipedal walking anatomy. So notice the upright posture here, and Lucy, an Australopithecus, she has a skeletal anatomy that permits this upright posture, and her feet are well adapted to walking. So let's look at this transition from a creature like Ardipithecus to Australopithecus. Ardi lived in the forest, kind of woodland environment. Ardi has a skull that indicates that Ardi did have an upright posture, but look at Ardi's feet. Ardi retained the ape feature of a grasping foot. Here is the skeleton down here, and we see the big toe goes out at an angle compared to the other toes. So this is a foot that is an adaptation for hanging on to trees and branches and things. And we still see this feature in modern chimps. So here's the chimp foot over here. Look at that big toe. And it is a grasping foot. So the transition from forest to grassland life involved natural selection favoring a new mode of locomotion, this upright posture, as well as the loss of grasping feet. So we go from a foot skeleton like this, where the big toe is out at an angle, to Lucy, who had a foot more like a modern human. Look at the human toe. It's in alignment. That's the big toe. It's in alignment with the other toes. So that was a key evolutionary transition, the evolution of bipedal walking, complete with the upright posture and the anatomical changes to the foot. And these are adaptations for walking on 2 feet, which would be an advantage in the grassland habitat. In fact, 3.6 million years ago, a volcano erupted and laid down a layer of ash, and evidently some of Lucy's kind, the Australopithecines, were walking across the landscape, and scientists have uncovered these ancient footprints, 3.6 million years old. Here's an artist's rendering of what the scene might have looked like, and this is Lucy's kind here, walking upright, gazing across the landscape. If they only knew the future potential of their species. Now let's consider another anatomical feature that changed over the course of human evolution. Here we see the hand of a chimp. Notice the fingers are very long, powerful, and they're kind of hook-shaped. And these are strong fingers for hanging onto branches. But look at that thumb. It's small. It really has a hard time sort of, opposing to all the other digits. It's not very powerful. So this is not a hand built for dexterity and strength in manipulating objects. Rather, it's a hand well adapted for tree life. But what we're going to see with the emergence of Homo habilis is a hand that starts to look more human. In the modern human hand, the fingers are smaller but more dexterous, but the thumb is larger and more powerful, and our thumb can oppose to all the other fingers. So the modern human hand, we have strong and opposable thumb and more dexterous fingers, and these features are better for manipulating objects. And Homo habilis, we begin to see the transition to a more modern hand. Now, what was habilis manipulating? They were manipulating stone tools. Now, there is evidence that some of the Australopithecines were using stone tools as well, but certainly Homo habilis was. And if you make a rock have a sharp edge, you can use it to scrape the meat off of a bone or to cut into the tough animal hide. And here we have an important evolutionary innovation, the introduction of more meat into the diet. And meat would be the fuel that made the evolution of larger and larger brains possible in their descendants. At first, Homo habilis and its kind were thought to be scavengers. Now, scavenging is no easy task. After all, you sort of have to get lucky, and you come upon an animal that has recently died, and other scavengers haven't beaten you to it. And there indeed were many other scavenger species. There were hyenas and jackals, and even lions will eat a dead animal, and vultures and things. So Homo habilis had their work cut out for them. Scavenging was not easy, but it did supplement their diet with meat. And also notice that a scavenging way of life just isn't possible in the forest condition. On the grassland, there are lots of animals out there, and when they die, they are a potential source of protein if you can get the meat off their bones. But for chimps in the forest, they just don't have as many occasions to find large animals that have just died, so the scavenging way of life wouldn't work for them. And again, this shows this new environment forced our ancestors to develop and discover and to perfect new ways of living. And that kind of thing is the trigger for new evolutionary change. So while Homo habilis introduced the scavenging mode of life in our human ancestors, Homo erectus took it to the next level with hunting. So here you take matters into your own hand. And this became a very successful way of maintaining a steady supply of meat in the diet of Homo erectus. And it is with Homo erectus that we also see a much more modern-looking skeleton. So in future lessons, we'll take a look at some of those anatomical changes from an ancestral ape, and we'll use the chimp as an approximation of the common ancestor skeletal form. And then we go to Lucy. There's a transitional species. She has features that are like apes, but also features that are more like the later humans. But Homo erectus really resembles the modern human anatomy, including long legs that are adaptations for running and other skeletal features that made Homo erectus a formidable hunter. It's also Homo erectus that began to control fire, and later on to use that fire to cook food. Again, a majorly important cultural innovation in the history of our species. Of course, most recently, humans have been domesticating plants and animals and starting to write things down. Now, in addition to physical changes that were evolving by natural selection, there were social changes as well in our ancestors. You'll recall that in chimps, the mothers and fathers, of course, contribute DNA to their offspring, but it's principally the mother that transmits the limited amount of culture to her offspring. Fathers don't play an important role in raising chimp babies. Well, that began to change in our lineage. So for our ancestors, the ape man had to become a family man. And the way that our ancestors had to make a living in this new grassland environment required that males take a more active role in providing resources to their own offspring. So we get a change in social structure in our ancestry. And the contribution of males to the family is just an example of a larger theme in human evolution. And that is the way our ancestors were making a living on the landscape and the grassland habitat involved high degrees of interdependence. And this means that individuals had to rely on each other to learn certain skills and to be motivated to help out when they could to meet the goals of the group. So whether you're scavenging or hunting, you have to be cooperating with your group mates to achieve success. And so this is a key change in the way our human ancestors had to make a living. In the forest, recall, with chimps today, it's mostly solitary foraging. They really don't have to put their minds together to meet most of their caloric needs. But not so for our human ancestors. The key to success for our ancestors was cooperating with group mates. They had to work together to meet their basic needs. Why was that? Because they were living in a new environment, the grassland, with new opportunities, but also new threats. Interestingly, the idea that the hunting way of life may have required greater levels of interdependence, that corresponds with the time frame of when we see the increase in brain size in the fossil record. So that perhaps is not an accident, that the more complex interdependent lifestyle of Homo erectus was setting up a selection pressure on brains. That larger brains were needed to process all this new cultural information of this interdependent group, and indeed make new innovations for the ways that the human group was doing things. So if we just look at the whole span of the 6 million years, evidently it didn't take a lot of brains to make the transition from the trees to the grassland initially and to do some scavenging. But with Homo erectus, we see that the life was getting more complicated, and that may have been a key selection factor in the evolution of the human brain. So the human journey then can be described very simply like this. We came from ape ancestors and evolved into small-brained bipedal apes, and then into larger-brained, group-living, tool-using human ancestors, and finally, fully cultural, language-using modern humans. And because this journey toward the human species involved a new environment, new diet, new social structures, new inventions, new brains, new discoveries, all of these new things were triggering evolutionary change. So we have a lot more evolutionary change in our lineage compared to the ape ancestors that stayed in the forests. So, anatomical changes were an important part of our story. Social changes were an important part of our story. Technology was an important part of our story. And culturally invented mental tools were an important part of the story. And in later lessons, we'll focus a bit more on language. But what does language allow us to do? It allows us to connect two minds. So we can communicate with others. We can share what we're thinking. We can put two brains together and figure stuff out. We can bounce ideas off each other. We can come up with better ways of doing things. We can learn new things about the world. We can make plans on how we should approach something. And all of this allows us to develop what psychologists call a collective brain. that because we can communicate our thoughts with each other, we can store the thinking of other people in our own minds. And so when one person makes a new discovery, they can share it, and then we can build on that discovery, and our culture can advance because we can communicate so effectively with language. So initially, we're going to call this a cultural invention, but then, of course, it did set up selection pressures on human brains to evolve circuitry that makes us especially prepared for language. And this becomes another important theme in human evolution, that culture becomes a selection pressure in the evolution of our brains and our bodies. What do we mean by culture? Our technology, the food preparation techniques, parenting, social organization, social norms, language itself. All of these factors then set up an environment that can be selecting among the variation in the human population. Whether you have this or that physical trait or this or that brain, these cultural elements can now start to do the selection process in addition to the physical environment. So, of course, in the evolution of the human species, a larger brain was a very, very, very important part of our story. But the way modern scientists look at that expansion of the cerebral cortex here is that bigger brains evolved as adaptations to culture. And, of course, we're also generators of new culture. But the idea is because culture was so important to the success of our ancestors, that's why we evolved larger and larger brains, to be better at learning the cultural knowledge, storing that knowledge, using that knowledge, and improving upon that knowledge. Because culture was the key to our success, that left its mark on the evolution of the human brain. So, to summarize then, in chimps, we have mothers and fathers contributing genes to their offspring, but minimal culture from the mother's side. In our kind, of course, mothers and fathers contribute genes to their offspring, but lots of culture as well. And indeed, other members of the human group transmit culture to offspring as well. So there's just a much greater cultural input into the brains of young humans. For our ancestors, culture would become the key to survival, and then culture influenced the evolution of our bodies and our brains. So, we can tell our story in brief. Our ancestors became bipedal and left the trees for a grassland habitat and a change in diet. They first had to collaborate to get food and discover and share new ways to get food and stay safe. Then they had to defend their resources for other human groups. These circumstances selected for individuals capable and motivated to put their minds together to solve problems. Language provided a bridge to connect minds. Collective learning massively increased cultural knowledge and skills. The new cultural environment selected for brains capable of acquiring, storing, using, and passing on cultural information. Our ancestors crossed a Rubicon that no other species has managed to do. Over evolutionary time, we evolved into a fully cultural species.